Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, Professor. And as you know, then my presentation will be in English, but it will be on a French translation of the Qur'an, as mentioned of Savary. I begin with a note of regret and a note of thanks. Regret that I cannot be there with you. Nantes is a place very dear to me, and so it's sad for me personally not to be there, but also to have missed some of the presentations this morning because of the time change. From Dr. Reginato, this was a wonderful presentation, which I think is well placed next to mine, except that hers is much more detailed and eloquent than mine will be. So I learned a lot on the question of poetry and prose in regard to the European view of the Qur'an. And there'll be interesting contrasts with Savary. Also, a note of thanks for all of the organizers, for Amanda, the work she did, for the whole team, John, Emmanuel, and everyone else. Very grateful to have been had my paper accepted and be among this group. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, enfin, je vais commencer. Thank you so much. So this is a very simple presentation, as mentioned, on the translation of Claude Etienne Savary of 1783. The principal argument is that Savary has often been presented as a translator with Enlightenment concerns for understanding the reasons for and the rationality of Muhammad's project as he saw it in the Qur'an. And I'd like to draw some attention to another aspect of the translation, which is his aesthetic concerns or his attempt to render the Qur'an in a way that does justice to what he assessed as a beautiful literary work. So there'll be some comments also on the nature of what he sees the project of Muhammad in writing the Quran and his technique, but the principal argument is simply his attempt to render the Quran beautifully. The first topic will just be a little bit on Claude Etienne Savary, and then his thoughts on the Quran. And then I've selected a series of texts that relate to the question of religion between quotation marks, so deen, in the Quran, so passages which relate to that theme. Also, there's another passage which I thought was interesting because there's a long note from Savary that's in Surah An-Nahl, or chapter 16 of the Quran. And then finally, some conclusions about the historical context of Savary. So hopefully that sounds okay. We'll start with Savary, life and thought. As may be well known to all of you, Savary traveled to Egypt before his translation of the Quran. In his preface, he sort of boasts of his firsthand familiarity with the Islamic world and the Arabic-speaking world. He was principally in Damietta, although he did travel around to other places in Egypt between 1776 and 1779. He didn't come home to France right away, but spent 2 years in Greece and then returns to France in 1781. And then in 1783, he published, as you see, Le Coran traduit de l'arabe, accompagné de notes, et précédé d'un abrégé de la vie de Mahomet. And as may be well known to you, this is the second published translation of the Quran in French after the 17th century translation of Duriyah. Although I learned in preparing this talk that there was an unpublished translation of Galland, which others there will know more about, that came after Duriyah and before Savary. In a really excellent article on the early French translations of the Quran, Larzoul comments that essentially Savary is marked by Enlightenment principles in his translation, so marqué par la pensée voltairienne, and again, l'approche rationaliste de l'islam que reflète l'ouvrage. She mentions that. So that's sort of the backdrop or the foundation for my talk and my argument, that there is a notion that Savary is principally marked by a rationalist, rationalizing Enlightenment approach to the Quran. And while not denying that, I'd like to add in the question of the aesthetics of his translations. Other works of our friend Savary include Morale de Mahomet, the year after the translation, excuse me, and then the year after that, Lettres sur l'Égypte. And you see on the right-hand side of the screen the preface of that work, where he comments to the effect that, oh, it's a good thing to travel. Staying at home, you can have a myopic view of the world, and when you travel, you're able to return to your home and have something to compare your government, your religion, the morals of your society with. So people should travel. And of course, later Europeans generally, and French in particular, have taken that to heart, especially in July and August. Okay, so Professor Tolan writes in his article, which introduces the project, the European Qur'an, in his preface of the translation, Savary sketched a portrait of Muhammad as one of those extraordinary men who, born with superior talents, appears now and again on the world stage to change it and to chain simple mortals to their chariots. Beautiful expression. And from my assessment of the preface as well, this is clearly his understanding of Muhammad, maybe to be understood within the context of hero, someone who has extraordinary natural gifts, but of course he sees the Quran as the work of Muhammad and not the work of God. And then this is another quotation from the preface given in the original French, where again, as I said, he boasts a bit, or as my children would put it, he flexes, saying that it's after having conversed with the Egyptians and studied their habits and the brilliance or the genius of their language that I finished this this work. And again, maybe redounding to the comment of Professor Tolan in the preface, he comments that the moral that Muhammad preaches is founded on the natural law. But also, here's a note that was popular among Enlightenment thinkers, not so much today, on what is conventional or appropriate for people in hot climates. That would not be the way we would see things now, but it was part of the rationalism, of course, of the Enlightenment period. So this, I mean, more or less confirms the arguments of Larzul and of Professor Tolan and how he saw the composition, Savary saw the composition of the Quran. Okay, on to some of his thoughts on the Quran. There you see the opening page of an early edition from 1803 of Savary on the right-hand side. It's important to put it in the context of earlier translations, and not so much the French of Durir, regarding which he was critical, calling it a flat translation, and later assessments of Durir is that it's also inaccurate. But rather, he seems to have been principally interested in Marathi. He, of course, the English translation of George Sale was published in 1734, but Savary seems not to have known English and does not refer to Sale as far as I know in the notes, but he does refer frequently to Marathi. So obviously he had the 1698 Latin translation of Marathi with him, but you see this critical note there that he, well, quite critical, not only of the betrayal of the actual sense of the Quran, but also in the barbarous Latin in which he sees Marathi of having written. But nevertheless, and as we will see in a couple of cases, he still seems to have relied on Marathi. So that's a good strategy that scholars have imitated for generations now, to criticize everything that came before while also relying on those earlier scholars. So as I mentioned, he sees the Quran as the work of Muhammad's natural abilities, but here we get a sense of how he, this is from a footnote, by the way, on in Surah An-Nahl on Quran 103, I mentioned that earlier. If you look it up at Savary, you'll find it at 105 because he follows the Flugel verse numbering of the Quran and not the, an earlier, not Flugel, but an earlier rendering of Quran verses, but not obviously the later system stabilized by the Cairo edition in 1924. Anyway, so he writes that he pretended that the doctrine that is Muhammad he preached was revealed by Gabriel. In order to successfully play this role, he had to have des connaissances qu'un génie élevé ne peut pas donner seul. So again, there's praise for Muhammad, but also a reference to the people around Muhammad. So he says he was instructed, that is Muhammad, in his travels, and also refers to Muhammad's practice of what is known in the Arabic sources as tahannuth, that is a spiritual retreat that Savary, following the Islamic sources, mentions. He speaks of this taking place in Montour. That's not really accurate. Tur is just another Arabic word for mountain, coming from the Aramaic. The mountain is Hira, as many will know, which allowed him to tie together different elements of his religious system. But also he has praise for the language of the Qur'an. So maybe this is a contrast with some of the thinkers brought up by Professor Reginato, when he says quelquefois aussi, quittant le langage ordinaire, il peint en vers majestueux l'Éternel assis sur le trône des mondes, donnant des lois à l'univers. So there's that. Again, he has this criticism of Duria, which you can read there, and clearly a high estimation, not only for Muhammad's natural genius, but also for the style of the Qur'an. Now, what he says in this quotation is that in the East, it is noted for the perfection of its style and its rhetorical brilliance. And then, of course, he critiques, or as my children would say, disses Duria, saying that it's just a rhapsodie plate et ennuyeuse. But the problem is the translation, not the original, and he means to amend that problem or solve it by his own translation. Again, a reference here to the magic of the style of the Qur'an, of the care with which Muhammad embellished his prose with the ornaments of poetry. So interesting to contrast that to what we just heard with the earlier excellent presentation. And also a mention to this interesting une marche cadencée, so a cadenced rhythm maybe, but also the rhyme of the verses. So, okay, and I'm going to turn now to a whole series of verses. I think there's 5 or 6, which I'll discuss, and I should finish in about 15 to 17 minutes, maybe somewhere around there, if that's okay. So I start with something from Surah Ar-Rum, so chapter 30 of the Qur'an. I imagine projected there on the big screen, these verses, these texts are going to be too small. And so my apologies for that, but I will talk you through it. So here you have the Arabic, and I'll bring up a couple more translations before turning to Savary. So the Arabic says, فَأَقِمْ وَشَكَ الدِّينَ حَنِيفًا فِطْرَةَ اللَّهِ الَّتِي فَطَّرَ النَّاسَ عَلَيْهَا. So following Sale, well, maybe just a literal translation is better. So orient your face to the Hanif, or the monotheistic religion, the instinct of God, which he created humans upon. There is no alteration to the creation of God. That is the upright religion, but most people do not understand. So there you have Duria and Marachi and Sale. Again, maybe you can't read it if the text is too small on the screen. But you have Savary. I just wanted to focus on the last bit of the verse, which speaks about religion. So it says, Dalika ad-din el-qayyim. So that is, and now just to give a standard French translation, Blachier says, c'est la religion immuable. Marachi has sort of a convenient Latin translation, which recta in Latin seems to follow closely from qayyim, so straight, standing upwards, or being rightly oriented. But then we have this very poetic translation of Savary, il est le culte saint et éternel. So, I mean, he might find some justification for that in the Islamic exegetical literature, but it seems to me there's also an intentional flourish there from getting Saint et Éternel from the word Qayyim, which others you can see something as, unmovable or simply right or recta, etc., etc. Okay, on to a second example from Surah Al-Imran, so chapter 3 of the Qur'an, very famous verse, which begins with this phrase, which Muslim exclusivists really like, which is Inna Deen 'Inda Allah al-Islam. Indeed, just a sort of standard translation, indeed, religion with God is either Islam, if you're an exclusivist and you imagine Islam with a capital I, or you translate that word as submission. And the verse goes on, which I may have more reason to comment on, but bringing up the different translations here, Asel says, verily the true religion in the sight of God is Islam, so a pretty standard translation. Also Marachi, certe religio apud Deum est Islam, is rendering of the Arabic there. That's fine. Savary has something similar, la religion de Dieu et l'islamisme. But I just wanted to mention that there is something here which seems to be added in the text. So if you follow the verse along after the beginning, ما اختلف الذين أوتوا الكتاب إلا من بعد ما جاءهم العلم بغيا بينهم. So you have this phrase بغيا بينهم, which here is rendered as out of envy among themselves. And Blacher, we'll see, translates that par mutuelle rébellion. But you see again a flourish with Savary, where he says l'envie, le soufflet son poison. So again, an effort to sort of be stylistically, aesthetically pleasing, or maybe to render what he sees as something of the aesthetics of the Arabic in French, but departing from the more simple meaning of the Arabic as usually understood. Again, Marachi, ob invidium inter se, basically the same as Sale and Blacher. Okay, so that's example number 2. Another verse from Surah Al-Imran. So similar idea, but here invoking Abraham. Ma kana Ibrahimu Yahudiyan wala Nasraniyan walakin kana Hanifan Musliman wa ma kana min al-mushrikeen. So Abraham was not a Jew or a Christian or Nazarene, but he was a pure monotheist, Hanif, and submissive, or Muslim with a capital M, maybe, and he was not one of the associators. And so basically the translators follow that pretty closely. You can see with Sale's translation, rendering Hanif as one of the true religion. Even Duria seems to understand the traditional meaning. Il professait, not sure how to pronounce that early French, l'unité de Dieu. And then Marachi has this interesting translation of Hanif. This is actually interesting, Marachi's translation, as orthodoxus. I think he's actually rendering some elements of the tafsir there, but I won't comment on it. And then with a capital M, he has muslimus. So instead of translating the word which Sale does, one resigned unto God, he just renders it as Muslim. And Savary clearly seems to be following Marachi in those two translations. So he calls him Orthodox and Musulman. And then he again seems to have a flourish at the end. The Arabic, it's a negative statement, Ma kana min al-mushrikeen. And most of them render that. Duria renders it as negative, so does Sale, so does Marachi, but Savary renders it as adorateur d'un seul Dieu. So really departing from the Arabic, but creating a nice flourish there. And again, if you relate Blacher, he hedges his bets by not translating Hanif at all, and even including the Arabic word Muslim in parentheses. Okay, Surah Al-Ma'idah, Quran 5 has this interesting bit towards the end, right before the scene of the table from heaven, where God actually speaks to the apostles of Jesus, an exceptional occurrence in the Qur'an, or he does wahi with the apostles. He says, وَإِذْ أَحْيَيْتُ إِلَى الْحَوَارِيِّينَ, indeed I inspired the Hawariyyin. And then the an generally marks direct speech in the Quran. So this is basically opening quotation mark. آمنوا بي وبرسولي قالوا آمنا واشهد بأننا مسلمون. So something like, I inspired the apostles, believe in me and in my messenger, understood by everyone to be Jesus, basically. And if you look up the tafsir, it will say Jesus, not Muhammad, just because of the chronological situation there. So the only thing I wanted to point out is that Savary inserts Jesus as the name of the messenger of the Rasul. So he makes that clear, again, departing or paraphrasing the tafsir more than reading the Arabic. And then at the end, he sort of departs from what he had done earlier with the word Islam, by rendering washhad bi annana muslimun as rend témoignage de notre foi. So ashhad is témoin, or shahada is témoin. So I mean, that's fine. Notre foi is his own addition, and you can translate it or compare the translation of Blacher, who says, "Est-ce que nous sommes des soumis?" Okay, this may be getting boring for all of you at this point, but there's only a couple more, and I'll go relatively quickly before I get on to some translations. I won't read through this all. It would be long for me to go through the Arabic and the earlier translations. I've split this into two slides because it's a long bit. But this is a famous verse which has the Bedouins. Arab is the Arabic word usually understood to be Bedouin. Sale says Arabs of the desert. And they come and they say, Amanna, and God tells the Prophet to tell them that they do not have Iman, they have Islam. So Sale renders, we have embraced Islam, for the faith hath not yet entered into your hearts. So that's fine. In the next slide, I have, again, the Arabic up there for reference. And then Savary, les Arabes disent, nous croyons, réponds-le, vous ne croyez point, dites, nous professons l'islamisme. La foi n'a point encore pénétré vos cœurs, etc., etc. And I just wanted to use this as an example of a place where he's obviously depending on Marachi. You would see that if we went back, but he even notes Marachi in a footnote, who says, he says the difference that the Muslims make between faith and Islam or submission is that the first is the internal belief, and the other is the external mark of this belief expressed through religious acts. So, and you can also see there the rendering of Blacher. Okay, that's the only point there. And then the last one before we get on to some conclusions is a famous verse, this time not rendering Islam or religion, but it struck me as interesting because of his use, a long footnote he has on this verse. So this is a verse which I don't have the Arabic up there, but it says something like لِقَدْ عَلِمْنَا إِنَّهُمْ we have known that they say إِنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ إِنَّمَا يُعَلِّمُهُ بَشَرٌ, only a human teaches Muhammad, but the tongue of the one to whom they refer is foreign, ajami, whereas this Qur'an is written in. And then just note this translation here, perspicuous, if I'm getting that English word right, which is my native language, but I'm not sure of the pronunciation, a perspicuous Arabic tongue. So that's a mubin. And then Marachi says klara, so clear. And then he says that means elegant. So just note that, because Savary says, Je connais le discours, un homme, disent-ils, that is the opponents of the Prophet, dicte le Qur'an. Again, this is departing from the text. It's not there in the Arabic. because the Arabic simply says inma yu'allimuhu bashar, but it's used also by Sale, he mentions there, but actually it's Marachi who's the closest, who just says profecto docet eum, celui qu'il soupçonne parle une langue étrangère, and then he says l'arabe du Qur'an est pur et élégant. So, I mean, he's sort of channeling Marachi, I think, there, but also just adding to the text, which simply says mubin, which usually just means clear, but Marachi says it means elegant, and so Savary in his translation says pure, not clear, but pure and elegant. Okay, and then there's this long note, which I won't read in its entirety, or I would never be invited back to an event of this great project. But I mean, if you maybe, hopefully you can see it on the screen if the text is big enough. I've quoted some of it on the earlier PowerPoint, and it just mentions the strategies that Muhammad used to combine different things. So it begins with this reference to cette variété d'opinion, and what he's referring to there is who is this man who the opponents are accusing of instructing Muhammad. So Savary notes a number of opinions about who this man is, and then he says the opponents were not right. Actually, this is the way, as I quoted before, he was instructed in his travels, etc., etc. This is the way that he got his information. I mean, it's not really defending Muhammad because it redounds to basically the accusation that the opponents make in 16103. But it gives us an opportunity to see how Savary imagines the composition of the Qur'an by Muhammad. Just to mention, I was lucky enough to get a printed book of Savary, but I have the 1905 Garnier edition. I'm not sure if it's been printed since then. Someone else maybe can mention that in the discussion, but the notes are all missing. So, but online, happily on Wikisource, you can find the 1821 Dufour edition that includes all of these notes. So just wanted to mention that. And just to compare Blacher briefly, I mean, he renders quite clearly and literally clear Arabic language or tongue, whereas you can see Savary is different. Okay, finally, conclusions. I'll wrap this up in a minute or two, and we can move to discussion. I just wanted to say a couple of things about the context. Savary, as mentioned before, is often presented as an Enlightenment thinker in his rendering of the Qur'an and his comments on the Qur'an. And again, I think that is true. But we're going to see something else as well. First, just to note that despite his criticism of Marachi, he clearly depends on Marachi. But then we've noticed his aesthetic touches in the translation. Just to give one more final example that's really interesting, this single word, Samad, well, it's Allah Samad in Quran 112. He translates Samad as à qui tous les êtres s'adressent dans le cœur. So, I mean, that's probably has some basis in tafsir. I mean, the tafsir is all over the place on this word, which is almost completely mysterious to the exegetes. But you can see he's trying to render some of what he sees as the stylistic elegance of the Quran in French. Obviously, I imagine this is not a new point to anyone here, but just to state it again, his engagement with the Quran is in no way polemical, with the exception of his assertion that Muhammad is the author. Maybe, I suppose, could be taken as polemic. But also one does not have the sense of a civilizing mission in his engagement with the Quran. But one does see is one of romance or romanticism. And so I just put this image from a nice cover of Chateaubriand from his work of his itinerary from Paris to Jerusalem. And he, of course, passes through Egypt, or I learned this. I shouldn't say, of course, because I just found this out researching for this paper. And so Chateaubriand had this romantic notion about Egypt. I think it's chapter 7 of his work. So you can read his romance with Egypt. Very different sort of person, very different approach to Napoleon, among other things. So that's something we could maybe comment on, but also to Catholicism and Christianity. But they both had this sort of romantic notion of the East And so I just wanted to note that in some ways, Savary's translation brings together the Enlightenment and the Romantic period. This is the work that I'm really indebted to by Es Larzul, that is open access, so anyone can get more information there. So very simple study, but thank you very much.